Close your eyes for a moment and let me take you on a journey back through time. Back to a world where bringing life into existence was itself a dance with death. Tonight, we'll walk together through the shadows of medieval birthing chambers, where courage and terror lived side by side, where hope and heartbreak were separated by the thinnest of veils. In our modern world, we turn on lights with the flip of a switch. We reach for medicine when we're unwell. We trust that help is just a phone call away. But imagine, if you will, a time when the miracle of birth was racked in such danger that every pregnant woman was, in essence, walking toward a cliff's edge, not knowing if she would find solid ground or fall into the abyss below. This is the story of why medieval childbirth was so dangerous. And it's a story that whispers to us across the centuries, reminding us of the incredible fragility and precious strength of human life. Picture yourself in a small stone cottage, perhaps in England or France, sometime in the year 1300. The walls are thick, built to keep out the bitter cold, but tonight they seem to hold in something far more frightening than winter's chill. Candlelight flickers against rough wooden beams, casting dancing shadows that seem to move with a life of their own. The air is heavy with the scent of burning herbs, rosemary, perhaps, or sage, mixed with something else, a scent that twists around you, filling the room with shadows melting into darkness. A silence hangs, broken only by the soft, distant sound of footsteps, something that makes your stomach clench with worry. You are a young woman, maybe 22 years old, and you are about to give birth to your first child. Your husband paces outside, forbidden from entering this sacred and terrifying space. Your mother sits beside you, her weathered hands cool against your fevered brow, but you can see the fear in her eyes. The same fear. It was a journey toward what people called the hour of her greatest trial. 1 in every 3 women who entered the birthing chamber would never leave it alive. Think about that for a moment. Imagine if every 3rd person who walked into a room simply vanished. That was the reality of medieval childbirth. The midwife arrives, her footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. She's an older woman, perhaps 50, with kind eyes but calloused hands that have delivered dozens of babies and closed the eyes of dozens of mothers. She carries with her a basket of herbs, some clean cloth, and centuries of knowledge passed down from mother to daughter. But for all her experience, for all her gentle wisdom, she also carries the weight of knowing that her tools are so very limited. In her basket, there are no antibiotics to fight infection, no sterile instruments to ensure cleanliness, no blood banks to replace what might be lost, no emergency surgeries to save a mother when things go wrong. There is only hope, prayer, and the fierce determination of women who have been facing this same terror for thousands of years. The birthing chamber itself tells a story of danger. The bed is surrounded by tapestries and curtains, not for privacy alone, but because people believed that evil spirits might try to harm the mother and baby. Holy relics are scattered around the room. A piece of the Virgin Mary's belt, perhaps, or a fragment of a saint's robe. These aren't just decorations. They're desperate attempts to call upon divine protection in a world where medicine offers so little. As labor begins, you feel the first crushing wave of pain, and suddenly the statistics become more than numbers. They become the faces of women in your village who never came home from their birthing chambers. There was Margaret, who died just last spring, bleeding until her life simply ebbed away. There was young Alice, barely 16, whose body was too small and who suffered for 3 days before death finally claimed her. There was Eleanor, who seemed to recover well, but then succumbed to fever a week later, leaving behind 4 children who would never understand why their mother simply stopped breathing. This is the world you inhabit tonight, a world where the very act of creating life might destroy it, where the gift of motherhood comes wrapped in such danger that every community knows the sound of mourning bells ringing for another young mother lost. But why? Why was this natural process so deadly? Why did something that should have been a celebration become a funeral so often? The answers lie in the very fabric of medieval life, in the way people lived, what they ate, how they understood the human body, and what they believed about sickness and health. Tonight, we'll explore these questions together, gently, like turning the pages of an ancient book by candlelight. We'll walk through the reasons why medieval childbirth was wrapped in such terror, why entire communities held their breath when a woman went into labor, and why the courage of medieval mothers deserves to be remembered with such reverence. In the soft glow of that medieval birthing chamber, let's turn our attention to the woman who has just entered, the midwife, the one person everyone hopes might make the difference between life and death. Her name might be Joan, or Margot, or Heloise, and she has been summoned because she knows things that other women don't. She knows which herbs might ease pain, which positions might help a baby come more easily, which prayers might call down divine assistance. But here's something that might surprise you, and something that made medieval childbirth so terrifyingly dangerous. This woman, for all her knowledge and good intentions, is working in almost complete darkness when it comes to understanding what's actually happening inside a woman's body. Imagine trying to repair a complex machine while blindfolded, with only the crudest tools and no understanding of how the machine actually works. That's what medieval birth attendants faced every single time they entered a birthing chamber. The midwife's hands, though gentle and experienced, haven't been washed with soap, not because she's careless, but because nobody yet understands that invisible creatures called germs can spread from person to person, causing deadly infections. Her tools, if she has any beyond her hands, haven't been cleaned with anything stronger than water, and sometimes not even that. She might use the same knife to cut an umbilical cord that she used yesterday to prepare herbs, or last week to help with a difficult birth where the mother died of infection. Without understanding about bacteria and sterilization, every tool becomes a potential weapon, and every helping hand becomes a possible carrier of death. The midwife's knowledge comes from other women, her mother, her grandmother, the wise women of her village. She knows that if a baby is positioned wrongly, she might be able to turn it by reaching inside the mother's body. She knows that certain herbs can strengthen contractions or ease pain. She knows that prayers to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, might help when medicine fails. But she doesn't know about blood pressure, or that sudden swelling might signal a deadly condition called eclampsia. She doesn't know that retained pieces of afterbirth can cause fatal infections. She doesn't know that excessive bleeding can be stopped with techniques that won't be discovered for centuries. Sometimes, when a birth becomes very difficult, the midwife might send for a physician, a man who has studied at university and read ancient texts about the human body. But here's one of the cruel ironies of medieval medicine. These learned men often made things worse, not better. The physician arrives with his book learning and his theories about how the body works. He might examine the mother, but his understanding of anatomy comes from texts written hundreds of years earlier, often based on the dissection of animals rather than humans. He might prescribe bloodletting, opening a vein to drain blood from an already exhausted woman. He might recommend purging, forcing the body to expel its contents through vomiting or diarrhea, further weakening someone who needs all her strength. In his medical bag, he carries instruments that look impressive but are often more dangerous than helpful. He might use forceps, metal tools designed to grasp a baby's head and pull it out. But without understanding how much force is safe, without knowing about the delicate structures inside a woman's body, without even proper anesthesia to make the procedure bearable. These men, despite their education and their good intentions, are working with knowledge that is centuries out of date and theories that are simply wrong. They believe that illness is caused by an imbalance of body fluids called humors. They think that a woman's womb might wander around inside her body, causing problems. They don't understand that infection is caused by microscopic organisms, or that blood loss can be fatal if not stopped quickly. Both the midwife and the physician are doing their best with the knowledge they have. The midwife offers comfort, experience, and intuition. The physician offers education and instruments, but neither of them truly understands what they're fighting against. In our modern world, we know that most of the deaths in medieval birthing chambers were caused by things that are now easily preventable or treatable. Infection, blood loss, high blood pressure during pregnancy, obstructed labor. These are challenges that modern medicine handles routinely. But in medieval times, they were death sentences, and the very people trying to help were often, unknowingly, making things worse. The tragedy is that everyone involved, the midwife, the doctor, the mother, the medicine's name, waiting for the other, the physician, the family members keeping vigil, everyone genuinely wanted to help. They were fighting against death with all the tools they had. But their tools were so limited, their understanding so incomplete, that the battle was often lost before it began. This is why medieval childbirth was so dangerous. Not because people didn't care, not because they weren't trying, but because they were fighting an invisible enemy with weapons that couldn't even see it, let alone defeat it. Now, let's step even deeper into that candlelit chamber, closer to the bed where a medieval woman labors, and try to understand what's happening inside her body and why it so often became a battleground where life and death struggled for victory. Picture the young woman we met earlier, feeling the waves of pain growing stronger, her body working with ancient rhythms to bring forth new life. In our modern world, we know that birth is a complex process, but one that usually unfolds safely when the conditions are right. In medieval times, however, those conditions were rarely right, and the woman's body became a place where multiple dangers could strike without warning. The first and most deadly enemy was bleeding, what we now call hemorrhage. Imagine, if you will, that every woman giving birth was walking on a path beside a cliff, and at any moment, the ground beneath her feet might simply give way. During and after birth, a woman's body naturally bleeds as the placenta, the organ that nourished the baby, separates from the wall of the womb. In a normal birth, this bleeding stops fairly quickly as the womb contracts and the blood vessels close. But sometimes, something goes wrong. Sometimes the womb doesn't contract properly, or the placenta doesn't separate completely, or blood vessels tear in ways that the body can't repair on its own. When this happened in medieval times, there was no way to stop it. The midwife might try pressing on the woman's belly, or giving her herbs to strengthen contractions, or even reaching inside to try to remove pieces of placenta by hand. But without understanding how blood clots form, without access to surgery, without the ability to replace lost blood, a woman could simply bleed to death while her family watched helplessly. The medieval chroniclers, when they wrote about these deaths, often described them with a kind of horrified fascination. They would write about how a woman seemed fine after giving birth, how she held her baby and smiled, and then, within hours, she would become pale, then weak, then unconscious, and finally, gone. The life would simply flow out of her, drop by drop, until there was nothing left to keep her soul tethered to this world. But bleeding wasn't the only invisible killer stalking medieval birthing chambers. there was another enemy, one that was even more mysterious and terrifying, because it struck not immediately, but days or weeks later, when everyone thought the danger had passed. This enemy was infection, and it moved through medieval birthing chambers like a phantom, touching some women and leaving others untouched, leaving families to wonder why their wife, their daughter, their sister had been chosen for such a cruel fate. The infection often began subtly. A woman who had given birth successfully would develop a fever a few days later. At first, it might seem like nothing serious. Perhaps she was just tired or catching a cold. But then the fever would grow stronger, and she would begin to complain of pain in her belly, and her skin would take on an unhealthy color. What was happening, though nobody understood it at the time, was that bacteria, tiny organisms invisible to the naked eye, were multiplying inside her body. They might have entered through the birth canal during labor, carried there by unwashed hands or unclean instruments. They might have been introduced when the midwife reached inside to help with a difficult birth, or when she tried to remove the placenta. Once inside, these microscopic invaders found perfect conditions to grow and spread. The medieval woman's body, exhausted from labor, weakened by poor nutrition, and lacking any understanding of how to fight infection, became an ideal place for these organisms to flourish. The infection would spread through her blood, causing what we now call sepsis, a condition where the body's response to infection becomes so intense that it starts to damage vital organs. The medieval woman would experience chills that no amount of blankets could warm, fevers that made her delirious, and pain that seemed to come from deep within her bones. Her family would watch in horror as someone who had seemed healthy just days before began to waste away before their eyes. They would try everything they knew: cold cloths for the fever, warm broths to give her strength, prayers and holy relics to call upon divine intervention. But nothing worked, because they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't defeat. The cruel irony is that this infection, which we now call puerperal sepsis or childbed fever, was often caused by the very people trying to help. The more invasive the assistance during birth, the more likely it was that deadly bacteria would be introduced. The physician who examined multiple women in a day, moving from one birthing chamber to another without washing his hands, might unknowingly carry death with him like an invisible cloak. But there was yet another way that medieval women's bodies betrayed them during childbirth. And this one was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all, because it struck the youngest and most vulnerable. In the flickering candlelight of medieval birthing chambers, some of the most tragic stories were those of the youngest mothers, girls who should have been playing with dolls, not delivering babies. Let me paint you a picture that might help you understand why youth itself became a death sentence in the medieval world. Imagine a girl named Isabella, perhaps 13 years old, with soft brown hair and eyes that still hold the innocent curiosity of childhood. She has been married for 6 months to a man 3 times her age, not by choice, but by arrangement between their families. Her body is still growing, still changing, still becoming the woman she was meant to be. But she is pregnant. And in medieval times, pregnancy didn't wait for readiness. It came whether the body was prepared or not. Isabella's hips are narrow, her pelvis still forming, her entire frame delicate in the way that only young girls can be. When labor begins, her body tries to do what nature intended, but the passage is too small, the baby too large for the space available. What should have been a natural process becomes a desperate struggle, with the baby trapped inside a birth canal that simply cannot accommodate it. In our modern world, this situation, called obstructed labor, is handled with careful monitoring and, if necessary, a cesarean section. But in medieval times, there was no such option. The midwife might try to help by changing Isabella's position or by reaching inside to try to turn the baby, but these efforts often caused more harm than good. The girl might labor for days, her strength ebbing away, her body tearing as it tries to accomplish something that is simply impossible. The most heartbreaking aspect of these cases was that they were entirely preventable. Isabella's body, given just a few more years to mature, would have been perfectly capable of safely delivering a baby. But medieval society, with its emphasis on early marriage and immediate pregnancy, was essentially sentencing these young girls to death for the crime of being too young. The chroniclers of the time, when they wrote about these deaths, often described them with a mixture of sorrow and acceptance that seems shocking to us today. They would write about how a young bride had died in childbirth, and then move on to discuss the arrangements for her husband's next marriage, as if the death of a 13-year-old girl was simply an expected part of life. But if youth was dangerous, so too was its opposite. Let me introduce you to another woman, someone we might call Margaret, who represents the other end of the spectrum. The mothers who had survived multiple births and were now paying the price for their endurance. Margaret is 35 years old, which in medieval times made her an elderly mother. She has given birth to 8 children, though only 5 have survived to adulthood. Her body tells the story of these pregnancies in ways that would make your heart ache. In the way she walks with a slight stoop, in the lines around her eyes that speak of nights spent in pain, in the way she sometimes places her hand on her back, as if trying to hold something together that is slowly falling apart. Each pregnancy has taken something from Margaret's body. Her bones have become more brittle as the growing babies drew calcium from her teeth and skeleton. Her muscles have been stretched and torn repeatedly, leaving her with constant pain. Her blood has become thin and weak, what we now know as anemia, because her body has been drained of iron with each pregnancy and birth. Now, pregnant for the 9th time, Margaret's body is simply worn out. She doesn't have the strength to handle the demands of labor. Her womb, scarred from previous births, might not contract properly. Her blood, already thin, might not clot effectively if bleeding begins. Her exhausted frame might not be able to fight off infection if bacteria enter her system. The tragedy is that Margaret, like Isabella, is trapped by the expectations of her time. Medieval society viewed pregnancy as a woman's primary purpose, and the idea of limiting pregnancies to protect a woman's health was virtually unknown. Women were expected to continue bearing children until they were physically unable to do so, and many died in the attempt. But there was another factor that made medieval childbirth even more dangerous, something that affected women of all ages and social classes. This was the simple, brutal reality of hunger, the way that chronic malnutrition weakened women's bodies and made them less able to survive the ordeal of giving birth. Picture, if you will, a woman whose daily diet consists of a piece of bread, perhaps some thin soup, and occasionally a bit of cheese or dried meat. She lives in a world where food is scarce, where famines are common, where most people go to bed hungry more nights than not. Her body, lacking the nutrients it needs to function properly, is already struggling just to keep her alive. Now imagine this same woman trying to grow a baby inside her undernourished body. The developing child will take what it needs from her, draining her already limited stores of vitamins and minerals. By the time she goes into labor, she is weakened, anemic, and lacking the physical reserves she needs to survive the ordeal ahead. This is the reality that most medieval women faced. Not just the danger of the birth itself, but the cumulative effect of years of poor nutrition, multiple pregnancies, and bodies that were simply too worn down to fight effectively against the many threats that surrounded childbirth. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the candles burned low and the birthing chamber grew still, there was an enemy present that no one could see, no one could fight, and no one could even imagine. This enemy was smaller than the tiniest grain of sand, invisible to the naked eye, yet more deadly than any sword or plague. This was the microscopic world of bacteria, and it turned every medieval birthing chamber into a battlefield where death had an overwhelming advantage. Let me take you inside the body of a medieval woman in the hours after giving birth, when she should have been celebrating the arrival of new life, but instead was beginning a fight for her own survival that she didn't even know she was fighting. Her name might have been Eleanor, and she had just delivered her second child after a long but successful labor. The baby was healthy, crying lustily, and Eleanor was tired but happy. She held her newborn close, feeling the warm weight of the tiny body against her chest, listening to the gentle breathing that told her this little one was strong and would survive. But inside Eleanor's body, something else was happening. During the birth, bacteria had entered her system. They might have come from the midwife's hands, which had been washed only with cold water. They might have been introduced when the midwife reached inside to help guide the baby's head, or when she tried to remove the placenta after the birth. They might have come from the cloth used to clean the baby, or from the knife used to cut the umbilical cord. These bacteria were so small that millions of them could fit on the head of a pin. They had no consciousness, no malice, no intention to cause harm. They were simply living organisms, doing what living organisms do, finding a place to grow and multiply. But the place they had found was inside Eleanor's body, and their presence there would soon become a death sentence. At first, Eleanor felt nothing unusual. The bacteria were few in number, and her body's defenses were trying to fight them off. But childbirth had left her weak and vulnerable. The process of labor had created tiny tears in her tissues, perfect entry points for infection. Her immune system, already strained by months of pregnancy and the ordeal of birth, was struggling to cope with this new threat. The bacteria began to multiply. 1 became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 8. Within hours, their numbers had grown exponentially, and they began to spread through Eleanor's bloodstream, carried to every part of her body by the very blood that was supposed to nourish and protect her. Eleanor's first symptom was a slight fever. She felt warm and told her mother that she was probably just tired from the birth. Her mother, experienced in these matters, wasn't immediately worried. Many women ran a small fever after giving birth. It usually went away on its own. But this fever didn't go away. Instead, it grew stronger. Eleanor's body temperature began to rise as her immune system fought desperately against the invasion. The fever caused her to sweat, which made her lose precious fluids. It made her confused and disoriented as her brain struggled to function in the heat. The bacteria continued to multiply and spread. They invaded her reproductive organs, causing intense pain and inflammation. They entered her bloodstream in such numbers that her body's defense systems became overwhelmed. What we now call sepsis was beginning, a condition where the body's response to infection becomes so intense that it starts to damage vital organs. Eleanor's heart began to race, trying to pump blood through vessels that were now inflamed and leaking. Her blood pressure dropped as her cardiovascular system began to fail. Her kidneys, struggling to filter toxins from blood that was now poisoned by bacterial waste products, began to shut down. Her family watched in growing horror as Eleanor, who had seemed fine just hours before, began to waste away before their eyes. Her skin became pale and clammy. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. She complained of terrible pain in her abdomen, and no amount of herbal remedies seemed to help. The midwife was called back, but she was as mystified as everyone else. She had seen this before: women who died days or weeks after apparently successful births. But she had no idea what caused it or how to stop it. She tried everything she knew: cool cloths for the fever, herbal teas to strengthen Eleanor's constitution, prayers to Saint Margaret for divine intervention. But nothing worked because the enemy was invisible and the weapons were useless. The bacteria continued their relentless multiplication, releasing toxins that poisoned Eleanor's blood and caused her organs to fail one by one. What makes this tragedy even more heartbreaking is that it was entirely preventable. The bacteria that killed Eleanor were the same ones that lived harmlessly on human skin and in the environment. They only became deadly when they entered her body through the wounds created during childbirth. If the midwife had washed her hands with soap, if the tools had been sterilized, if the birthing environment had been clean, Eleanor might have lived to raise her children and grow old, surrounded by grandchildren. But soap was a luxury that most people couldn't afford. The concept of sterilization wouldn't be understood for centuries. The existence of bacteria wouldn't be discovered for another 400 years. Eleanor died fighting an enemy that wouldn't even be identified until long after her great-great-grandchildren were gone. This invisible army of death stalked every medieval birthing chamber. It was present at every birth, waiting for the opportunity to strike. It killed rich and poor alike, young and old, healthy and weak. It was the ultimate equalizer, caring nothing for social status or personal virtue. In the cold stone cottage where our medieval mother lies recovering, there's another story being told. One written in the hollow curves of her cheeks, the brittleness of her hair, the way her body seems to fold in on itself like a flower closing at dusk. This is the story of how hunger itself became a killer, how the simple lack of proper food turned the miracle of birth into a death sentence for countless women. Let me introduce you to a woman we might call Agnes, who lives in a small village in northern England in the year 1315. This is a year that historians call part of the Great Famine, when the rains fell too heavily and the crops failed, when winter lasted too long and spring came too late. But for Agnes, famine isn't just a word in history books. It's the daily reality of going to bed hungry, of feeling her body consume itself to stay alive. Agnes is 24 years old and pregnant with her third child. Her husband is a farmer, but their small plot of land yields barely enough to keep them alive, even in good years. This year, with the crops failing and grain prices soaring, they are slowly starving. Agnes's daily meal consists of a small piece of bread made from a mixture of wheat and ground acorns, perhaps a thin soup made from roots and herbs, and occasionally a bit of cheese or dried meat. Her body, lacking the nutrients it needs to function properly, is already struggling to keep her alive. Now, with a baby growing inside her, she faces an impossible choice: feed the child growing in her womb, or keep enough nutrition for herself to survive the ordeal of birth. The developing baby will take what it needs from the mother's body, regardless of what this means for her health. If Agnes doesn't eat enough calcium, the baby will draw it from her bones and teeth, leaving her with brittle bones and rotting teeth. If she doesn't consume enough iron, the baby will take it from her blood, leaving her weak and anemic. Agnes's body becomes a battlefield where the unborn child fights for resources against the mother's own survival. And in medieval times, when food was scarce and nutrition was poor, this was a battle that the mother often lost. As Agnes's pregnancy progresses, she becomes increasingly weak. Her legs can barely carry her weight. Her hands shake when she tries to work. She becomes dizzy when she stands up too quickly. Her body is literally consuming itself to nourish the growing baby, breaking down her own muscles and organs to provide the nutrients that the child needs. When labor begins, Agnes's body lacks the strength to cope with the demands of birth. Her weakened muscles can't contract effectively. Her exhausted heart can't pump enough blood to supply both her vital organs and the working muscles of her uterus. Her depleted blood, thin and lacking in the components needed for clotting, can't stop bleeding if something goes wrong. The tragedy is that Agnes is fighting not just one enemy, but many. The malnutrition that weakens her body also makes her more susceptible to infection. Her immune system, lacking the vitamins and minerals it needs to function properly, can't fight off the bacteria that enter her system during childbirth. Her body, already pushed to its limits by starvation, has nothing left to give when faced with the additional stress of labor and delivery. But Agnes's story isn't unique. She represents thousands of medieval women whose bodies were slowly destroyed by the simple lack of adequate food. In a world where most people lived on the edge of starvation, pregnancy became a luxury that many women's bodies simply couldn't afford. The irony is that medieval people often had access to food that was actually quite nutritious when they could get it. Fresh vegetables, whole grains, dairy products, and meat were all part of the medieval diet. But these foods were often unavailable, either because of crop failures, because they couldn't afford them, or because they were reserved for the wealthy. Even in good years, medieval women often ate last and least. In a world where men did the heavy physical labor, they were given the largest portions of food. Children, being small and growing, were fed before their mothers. Women, especially pregnant women, were left to survive on whatever remained. This pattern of deprivation had cumulative effects that made each pregnancy more dangerous than the last. A woman who survived her first birth while malnourished would enter her second pregnancy already weakened. Her body would have fewer reserves to draw upon, less strength to cope with the demands of growing another child. Agnes represents not just the tragedy of individual women, but the systematic destruction of female health that occurred when societies couldn't or wouldn't provide adequate nutrition for their most vulnerable members. She died not because she was weak or unlucky, but because she was caught in a system that valued her life less than it valued the lives of others. Her death in childbirth wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a social failure, a consequence of a world that allowed its women to slowly starve while expecting them to continue the miracle of creating new life. Agnes's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest dangers aren't the dramatic ones, not the sudden catastrophes or the obvious threats, but the slow, grinding destruction that comes from simple neglect. In the quiet hours after midnight, when the medieval world slept fitfully under star-filled skies, there was a calculating coldness at work that would chill your heart to understand. This was the mathematics of medieval childbirth, the brutal arithmetic that determined who lived and who died, who would see their children grow, and who would be buried in the churchyard before their babies learned to walk. Let me share with you the numbers that haunted every medieval woman who felt the first stirrings of life in her womb. Numbers that turned pregnancy from a blessing into a game of chance, where the stakes were life itself. Imagine, if you will, a village of perhaps 300 souls, nestled in a valley where the river runs clear and the fields stretch green toward distant hills. In this village, there are perhaps 60 women of childbearing age, women between the ages of 15 and 45, who might, at any time, find themselves carrying new life. Now, here's the number that would make your blood run cold. In any given year, roughly 20 of these women will die. Not from war, not from plague, not from accident, but from the simple act of giving birth. 20 women, each with a name, a family, dreams and fears and hopes for the future. 20 women who will never see their children take their first steps, speak their first words, or grow into adults. But the mathematics of death go deeper than these raw numbers. They reveal patterns that show us just how systemic and predictable this carnage was. Young women, girls really, their bodies, still growing and changing, simply weren't ready for the demands of pregnancy and birth. Of every 10 girls who married before age 16, 3 would die in childbirth before their 20th birthday. The numbers tell us other stories, too. Women who had already given birth successfully had a better chance of survival than first-time mothers, but only up to a point. After the 5th pregnancy, the mathematics of survival began to shift again. Bodies worn down by repeated births, nutrition depleted by constant pregnancy and breastfeeding, began to fail. Women who had successfully delivered 6 or 7 children often died delivering their 8th or 9th. The time of year mattered too. Women who gave birth during the winter months, when food was scarce and cold weakened their bodies, died at higher rates than those who delivered in summer. The season of death was predictable. Social class offered some protection, but less than you might expect. Wealthy women had access to better food, cleaner environments, and more skilled attendants. They died at a rate of perhaps 1 in 4, rather than the 1 in 3 that claimed poorer women. But even wealth couldn't overcome the fundamental ignorance of medieval medicine. Noble women with access to university-trained physicians sometimes died at higher rates than poor women attended only by village midwives, because the physicians' interventions were often more dangerous than helpful. The mathematics also reveal something heartbreaking about the psychology of medieval women. Letters and documents from the time show us that women approached each pregnancy with a mixture of hope and resignation that is difficult for us to comprehend today. They wrote wills before going into labor, not as a precaution, but as a practical necessity. They said goodbye to their older children, not knowing if they would live to see them again. Some women, understanding the mathematics all too well, tried to limit their pregnancies. They used herbs that were supposed to prevent conception, or techniques that were supposed to make pregnancy less likely. But these methods were unreliable, sometimes dangerous, and often condemned by the church. Most women simply accepted that pregnancy was both their duty and their likely death sentence. The numbers also tell us about the ripple effects of all this death. Villages where many women died in childbirth became places where children grew up without mothers, where men remarried quickly out of necessity rather than choice, where the knowledge that women passed from mother to daughter about healing, about household management, about the raising of children, was lost with each death. Entire family lines disappeared when women died in childbirth. A woman who died delivering her first child took with her not just her own life, but the lives of all the children she might have had, all the grandchildren who would never be born, all the contributions she might have made to her community. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these numbers is how they were accepted as normal. Medieval people didn't see the death of women in childbirth as a crisis to be solved, but as a natural part of life to be endured. They prayed for divine intervention, but they didn't imagine that human knowledge and skill might be able to change these terrible odds. The mathematics of medieval childbirth reveal a world where half the population lived under a sentence of death that could be carried out at any moment, where the act of creating life was so dangerous that it was literally a matter of life and death, where women's bodies were seen as vessels for new life, but where their own lives were considered expendable in the process. These numbers aren't just statistics. They're a record of human suffering on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. They remind us that behind every percentage point, every fraction, every ratio, there was a real woman with a real life, real dreams, and real people who loved her and mourned her loss. In the growing darkness of our medieval night, as the candles burn lower and the shadows grow longer, there's something else we must acknowledge, something that makes this story even more heartbreaking than the statistics and the medical horrors we've already explored together. This is the silence that surrounds these women, the way their stories were forgotten almost as soon as they died, the way their voices were lost to history, as if they had never existed at all. Let me tell you about a woman whose name we'll never know. She lived in a small town in what is now Germany, sometime in the 14th century. She might have been called Greta or Bertha or Margaret, but her name was never written down anywhere that survived. She was the wife of a baker, the mother of 2 young children, and she died in childbirth at the age of 26 while trying to bring her 3rd child into the world. This woman lived and breathed and laughed and cried. She worried about her children when they were sick, felt joy when they took their first steps, sang lullabies to help them sleep. She had opinions about her neighbors, favorite foods, moments of happiness and sorrow. She was a complete human being with a full, rich inner life. But when she died, her story died with her. There was no newspaper to record her passing, no public monument to mark her sacrifice. The church might have recorded her death in their records, but only with the briefest notation, perhaps just her first name and the cause of death. Her husband, her children, if they survived, might have remembered her for a few years, but eventually, even their memories would fade. This is the silence that haunts medieval history. The voices of countless women who died in childbirth and were then forgotten, as if they had never existed at all. Their stories weren't considered important enough to record. Their struggles weren't seen as worthy of remembrance. Their deaths were treated as so commonplace that they barely warranted mention. Think about what this means. In our modern world, when a woman dies in childbirth, it's considered a tragedy worthy of investigation, discussion, and efforts to prevent it from happening again. In medieval times, it was so routine that it was often treated as simply part of the natural order of things. The chroniclers of the time, the monks and clerks who wrote down the events they considered important, rarely bothered to record the deaths of ordinary women. They might mention the death of a queen or a noblewoman, but only because it affected succession or politics. The death of a baker's wife, a farmer's daughter, a merchant's spouse. These were seen as too insignificant to deserve historical attention. This silence wasn't accidental. It reflected the way medieval society viewed women's lives. Women were valued primarily for their ability to produce children, particularly male children who could inherit property and carry on family names. When a woman died in childbirth, she was seen as having failed in her primary purpose, and her individual worth was often forgotten in the immediate practical concerns of what to do with her children and how to replace her household labor. The silence also reflects the way medieval people thought about death itself. In a world where death was common and life was uncertain, individual deaths, unless they were particularly dramatic or affected important people, were often treated as routine events. The death of a woman in childbirth was sad, but it wasn't considered unusual or shocking. But this silence has had consequences that reach across the centuries to touch us today. Because these women's stories weren't recorded, we've lost their voices, their perspectives, their wisdom. We don't know what they thought about their own lives, what they hoped for, what they feared. We don't know how they tried to protect themselves, what methods they used to try to survive, what advice they gave to their daughters. The silence has also made it easier for later generations to romanticize medieval life, to imagine it as a time of chivalry and courtly love, while ignoring the brutal reality of what life was actually like for most women. When we don't hear the voices of the women who died, it's easier to forget that they ever lived at all. But sometimes, very rarely, the silence is broken. Sometimes we find a letter, a diary entry, a legal document that gives us a glimpse into the real experiences of medieval women facing childbirth. These fragments are precious beyond measure because they remind us that behind every statistic was a real person with real feelings. One such fragment comes from a letter written by a woman named Marjorie in 15th century England. She was writing to her husband while she was pregnant, and she said something that breaks your heart with its simple honesty. "I am so afraid of this birth that I cannot sleep at night. I am so afraid of this birth that I cannot sleep at night." In those few words, we hear the voice of a real woman, experiencing the same fears that women have always experienced, but facing them in a world where those fears were all too likely to come true. Marjorie's letter survived by accident. It was preserved in a collection of family documents. But how many thousands of other women felt exactly the same way and left no record of their fear? The silence also extended to the children who were left behind. When a woman died in childbirth, her older children were often too young to understand what had happened, and there was no tradition of helping them process their grief or remember their mother. These children grew up with a hole in their lives that could never be filled, but their loss was rarely acknowledged or addressed. The silence even extended to the fathers and husbands who lost their wives. Medieval men were expected to be strong and practical, to remarry quickly and move on with their lives. There was little recognition of their grief, little acknowledgement of their loss. They were left to carry their sorrow alone, while appearing to the world as if nothing had happened. This silence isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a form of violence, a way of erasing the experiences and suffering of half the population. When we don't remember these women, when we don't acknowledge their struggles, we're completing the process of erasure that began the moment they died. But tonight, in this quiet moment between us, we're breaking that silence. We're remembering the unnamed baker's wife, the frightened Marjorie, the countless others whose names are lost but whose humanity remains. We're acknowledging that their lives mattered, that their deaths were tragedies, that their stories deserve to be told even if they can never be fully recovered. In remembering them, we're doing something that their own world failed to do. We're saying that their lives had value, that their suffering was real, that their courage in facing the terrifying prospect of childbirth deserves to be honored and remembered. As our medieval night deepens and the last embers in the fireplace fade to glowing ash, there's one more aspect of this story that we must explore together. Perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. This is the way that medieval women lived, with the knowledge of their own mortality. The way they carried the weight of knowing that each pregnancy might be their last, each birth might be their final act on this earth. Imagine, if you will, what it would be like to live every day, knowing that something as natural as creating life could kill you. Not might kill you, not could possibly kill you, but very likely would kill you if you did it often enough. This was the reality that every medieval woman carried with her from the moment she reached marriageable age until the day she died. Let me introduce you to a woman we'll call Catherine, who lived in France in the 13th century. Catherine is 19 years old, and she has already buried one child who died in infancy. Now she is pregnant again, and as she feels the baby moving inside her, she experiences a complex mixture of joy and terror that modern women can barely comprehend. Catherine loves the life growing within her. She talks to the baby, sings to it, dreams about what it will look like and who it will become. But at the same time, she knows that this pregnancy is quite literally a matter of life and death. She has watched her own mother die in childbirth. She has held the hands of friends and neighbors as they breathed their last in birthing chambers. She has seen too many women disappear into those rooms and never come out alive. So Catherine lives with a kind of psychological burden that is almost impossible for us to imagine. Every day of her pregnancy, she must balance hope against fear, love against terror, the joy of creating life against the very real possibility that doing so will end her own. This psychological weight shaped every aspect of how medieval women approached pregnancy and childbirth. They wrote wills before going into labor, not as a precaution, but as a practical necessity. They said goodbye to their older children, not knowing if they would live to see them grow up. They made arrangements for their households, their possessions, their responsibilities, as if they were preparing for a journey from which they might never return. The medieval church, recognizing this reality, developed special rituals and prayers for women about to give birth. There were blessings for pregnant women, special saints to pray to, relics that were supposed to offer protection. But these religious consolations, while providing some comfort, also served to reinforce the idea that childbirth was inherently dangerous and that survival was ultimately in God's hands, rather than under human control. Catherine's husband, too, lived with this weight. Every time his wife became pregnant, he knew that he might lose her. He had to balance his desire for children against his fear of losing the woman he loved. He had to prepare himself emotionally for the possibility that he might soon be a widower, that his children might soon be motherless, that his household might soon be left without its central figure. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this psychological burden was the way it affected the relationships between mothers and their children. Catherine, knowing that she might die in childbirth, couldn't allow herself to become too attached to the life growing inside her. She had to maintain some emotional distance, some psychological protection, in case the worst happened. This created a terrible paradox. The very women who were sacrificing their lives to bring children into the world couldn't allow themselves to fully embrace the joy of motherhood because that joy was too dangerous to their psychological survival. They had to love their children, enough to risk death for them, but not so much that the possibility of death would destroy them emotionally. The weight of inevitability also affected how medieval women related to each other. Pregnancy and childbirth created bonds between women that were forged in shared terror. Women who were about to give birth were surrounded by other women who understood exactly what they were facing, who had faced the same fears and might face them again. But these relationships were also tinged with a kind of survivor's guilt. Women who had successfully given birth multiple times knew that they had been lucky, that their survival was not due to their own strength or virtue, but to chance. They knew that other women, no less deserving, had died in situations identical to ones they had survived. Catherine represents thousands of medieval women who lived their entire adult lives under this psychological burden. They loved their children. They wanted families. They found joy in motherhood. But they did all of this while carrying the constant awareness that their next pregnancy might be their last. This awareness shaped not just individual psychology, but entire cultural attitudes toward women, motherhood, and life itself. Medieval society developed elaborate rituals around pregnancy and childbirth, partly as a way of managing the collective anxiety about women's mortality. The churching ceremony, performed when a woman had successfully survived childbirth, was as much a celebration of survival as it was a religious ritual. The weight of inevitability also helps explain why medieval women were often portrayed as resigned to their fate, as accepting their suffering without complaint. This wasn't because they were naturally passive or submissive. It was because they understood that there was literally nothing they could do to change their circumstances. They couldn't choose not to get pregnant. They couldn't choose safer methods of birth. They couldn't choose better medical care. Their only choice was how to face the inevitable with whatever dignity and courage they could muster. Catherine's story reminds us that the danger of medieval childbirth wasn't just physical. It was psychological, emotional, and spiritual. These women didn't just risk their bodies when they became pregnant. They risked their hearts, their minds, their very sense of self. They had to find ways to live with hope while acknowledging despair, to embrace life while accepting death, to love their children while protecting themselves from the pain of potential loss. In our modern world, where childbirth is generally safe and pregnancy is usually a time of joy and anticipation, it's difficult to imagine what it would be like to live with this constant awareness of mortality. But understanding this psychological burden helps us appreciate the incredible courage of medieval women who chose to create life despite knowing the cost, who found ways to love and hope and dream, even while living under the shadow of death. As our long night together draws toward its end, and the first pale light of dawn begins to touch the windows of our imaginary medieval cottage, there's something beautiful and bittersweet I want to share with you. This is the story of how, very slowly, very gradually, the darkness that surrounded childbirth began to lift, not in medieval times, but in the centuries that followed, as human knowledge and compassion finally began to catch up with human need. The woman we've been following, let's call her Eleanor, represents not just the tragedy of medieval childbirth, but also the beginning of hope. She lived at the very end of the medieval period, perhaps in the 15th century, when the first tiny sparks of medical understanding were beginning to illuminate the darkness that had claimed so many women before her. Eleanor's story begins, like so many others, with fear, with danger, with the terrible knowledge that she might not survive the birth of her child. But Eleanor lived at a time when a few scattered physicians were beginning to ask new questions, to challenge old assumptions, to wonder if there might be better ways to help women safely through the ordeal of childbirth. One of these physicians was a man we might call Master William, who had studied at the University of Paris and had read not just the ancient texts that had guided medieval medicine, but also some newer works that suggested different approaches to healing. Master William was beginning to suspect that some of the traditional treatments, the bloodletting, the purging, the harsh medications, might actually be making women sicker rather than helping them. When Master William attended Eleanor's birth, he did something revolutionary. He did less, not more. Instead of intervening aggressively, he watched carefully and only acted when absolutely necessary. Instead of weakening Eleanor with bloodletting, he made sure she had nourishing food and clean water. Instead of overwhelming her with harsh medicines, he used gentler remedies that supported her body's natural processes. Eleanor's birth was still dangerous, still frightening, still surrounded by all the risks that had claimed so many women before her. But she survived, and her survival was part of a slowly growing pattern of women who were beginning to benefit from the first glimmers of more scientific medical understanding. This was the beginning of a transformation that would take centuries to complete. The Renaissance brought new interest in anatomy and physiology. The scientific revolution brought new methods of observation and experimentation. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about the value of human life and the possibility of progress. Each of these intellectual movements contributed something to the eventual transformation of childbirth from a likely death sentence into a generally safe experience. But the change was painfully slow, and thousands of women continued to die while human knowledge gradually, incrementally, began to catch up with human need. The discovery of bacteria in the 19th century finally explained why so many women died of infection after childbirth. The development of antiseptic techniques finally provided a way to prevent these infections. The invention of anesthesia finally made it possible to perform surgery without causing unbearable pain. The discovery of blood types finally made blood transfusions safe and effective. Each of these advances saved thousands of lives, but they came centuries too late for Eleanor and Catherine and Agnes and all the other women whose stories we've shared tonight. These women died in darkness, not knowing that solutions to their problems were possible, not knowing that their suffering was preventable, not knowing that future generations would find ways to make childbirth safe. But their deaths were not meaningless. Every woman who died in childbirth left behind family members who carried the grief of her loss. Every community that lost young mothers understood viscerally the cost of medical ignorance. Every physician who watched helplessly as a woman died was motivated to search for better answers. The accumulated weight of all this suffering, all this loss, all this grief, eventually became a force that drove human civilization to find better ways. The medieval women who died in childbirth became part of the foundation upon which modern obstetric medicine was built. Their deaths demanded that future generations do better. In our modern world, we have largely conquered the dangers that killed Eleanor and Catherine and Agnes. A woman giving birth today has roughly a 99.97% chance of survival. The infections that killed thousands of medieval women can be prevented with simple hygiene or cured with antibiotics. The bleeding that claimed so many lives can be stopped with modern surgical techniques. The obstructed labor that killed young girls can be resolved with cesarean sections performed under safe anesthesia. But we must remember that these victories were built on the bodies of countless women who died before these solutions were available. Every time a woman today gives birth safely, she is benefiting from knowledge that was purchased with the lives of women who came before her. The dawn of understanding that began in Eleanor's time has become the bright daylight of modern medicine. But we must never forget the long, dark night that preceded it, or the women who died in that darkness, while humanity slowly, painfully, learned how to save them. Their courage in facing the terrifying prospect of childbirth, their sacrifice in giving their lives to bring new life into the world, their silent suffering in the face of medical ignorance. All of this has meaning because it eventually led to a world where their daughters and granddaughters could bear children without facing the same terrible risks. As we prepare to leave our medieval cottage and return to our modern world, we carry with us the memory of these women. We remember their names when we can. We honor their sacrifice when we can't. We acknowledge that the safety we take for granted was built on their suffering. And we remember that their deaths were not in vain. If we use our knowledge to continue making childbirth safer for all women, everywhere. The dawn that began in Eleanor's time has become our day. And in that light, we can see clearly the courage and strength of the women who lived and died in the darkness before us. Their stories remind us of how far we have come, and they inspire us to continue the work of making the world safer for the women who will come after us. And so, as the first light of dawn touches the windows of our cottage, we say goodbye to Eleanor and Catherine and Agnes and all the unnamed women whose stories we've shared tonight. We thank them for their courage. We honor their sacrifice, and we promise to remember their stories as we continue the work of building a world where no woman has to face the terror that they faced, where no woman has to rest now, brave women of the medieval world. Your suffering is over. Your sacrifice is remembered, and your courage lives on in every woman who gives birth safely today. The dawn you could not see has finally come, and in its light, we see clearly the debt we owe to you and the responsibility we bear to continue the work you could not complete. Sleep well, and know that you are remembered, you are honored, and you are not forgotten.